So some talk recently about potential worry of World War III or nuclear war escalating. I've heard around Ukraine specifically, the
Mhm.
conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Let's say Russia were to crumble or were to faction, it would be possible to have states or nation states that then had access to nuclear arms. And I think it's almost impossible for people to imagine what the world would look like if it actually escalated to that level. And I'm curious, in your research, in your conversations with these people, what kind of picture did they paint? I mean, what did they think about what it would potentially look like in the scenario that we did in fact escalate? Prevention's failed and it does happen, whether it's
Yes.
between the US nation states or even, non-nation states to somehow get access to these nuclear arms.
In nuclear war scenario, I take the reader from nuclear launch to nuclear winter. And it happens very fast, and it is a ticking time clock scenario. And the reason I did that stemmed from an interview I did with the US commander of STRATCOM. And STRATCOM, for listeners who don't know, US Strategic Command. The commander is the steward of all nuclear weapons and all nuclear weapon systems. In the event of a nuclear counterstrike that the president needed to make, he speaks directly with the STRATCOM commander. There is no one between them, not this, no one. And when I was speaking to retired General Keeler, I asked him in the course of our interview what would happen in a full-scale nuclear exchange with Russia. And he said to me, Annie, the world would end in the next couple of hours. And that I knew, in that moment, I knew I had the book. I knew that was coming from that person was not something that should ever be taken lightly. And by the way, STRATCOM commanders don't generally talk to journalists.
That sounds reasonable. I can imagine they're not looking for a lot of press.
And I understood the existential threat. So I began to source the book around, working from that quote. What I also was stunned to learn from Andrew Weber, who was the top ranking nuclear advisor to several presidents, that a bolt out of the blue attack is what Washington fears most. And that's a single weapon, as you mentioned, rogue or otherwise, coming at Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
And so I took those two and a lot of other sources and interviews that I did to demonstrate what would happen, how when nuclear war begins, it only ends in nuclear Armageddon. And this is something we know from one of the very rare nuclear war games that has been declassified by the Pentagon. So they do hundreds of them a year, believe it or not, and they're all incredibly classified. But one has been declassified. I reprint a page of it in the book, and readers sometimes say to me, why did you print this? You look at it and it's just all black. And there's one word in that reprint and it says scenario. That's all the government wants you to know. This is a scenario and you can't know what happens. And I show you what happens. But you may say, well, why print that? Well, in declassifying that one war game, it's called Proud Prophet and it's from the 80s. In declassifying that, the individuals involved in that wargaming scenario, it was 2 weeks long, were able to speak generally about nuclear war scenarios without defying their security clearance. And so, for example, a professor from Yale named Paul Bracken, who worked on that program, was able to share generally about what happens in a nuclear war game. And he's the one who told us, no matter how nuclear war begins, whether NATO is involved, whether China is involved, whether they're not involved, no matter how it begins, it only ends in nuclear Armageddon. And Bracken said that all the individuals, all the nuclear command and control people involved in that war game left very depressed.
Hmm. Is the Armageddon, and I mean, it sounds like a species destroying, if not a world destroying event. I mean, obviously there's the proximity, and actually this is a good question for you too. I'm curious, the modern lexicon Oppenheimer, the Oppenheimer project has been kind of pulled back in due to the movie, not saying that it's a nonfiction movie, but it brought the
Mhm.
Manhattan Project back into people's minds. But that was atomic. Can you
Yeah.
explain? And actually, one of the most shocking things about that movie for me is the math was pretty certain, but not 100% concrete that they were not going to ignite the atmosphere when they cooked that thing off, which is not something that I was aware of. So that, they were pretty sure on their numbers, but the numbers didn't show with absolute certainty. And again, that was an atomic bomb. Could you describe the difference between an atomic bomb and a nuclear bomb from just size and scope and scale?
Mhm, mhm. So the nuclear weapons would be what we would consider today. I mean, sorry, the atomic weapons would be what we would maybe call today tactical weapons. Hiroshima was 15 kilotons and Nagasaki was 21 kilotons. The thermonuclear bombs measure in the megatons, and it's almost impossible for the human mind to understand that scale of magnitude. For the book, I interviewed the man who wrote the architectural plans for the very first thermonuclear bomb ever exploded. We did a weapons test in the Pacific called the Ivy Mike thermonuclear test. It was 10.4 megatons. And the designer's name was Richard Garwin. People often think of Edward Teller as the father of the thermonuclear bomb, Oppenheimer being the father of the atomic bomb. But actually, Edward Teller couldn't figure out how to make the thermonuclear weapon explode. He could only imagine it theoretically. And so this
Hmm.
24-year-old kid named Richard Garwin, a student of Enrico Fermi, is the one who was able to make that bomb explode. And Garwin, now in his 90s, I interviewed at length with him in the book, and he explained it to me. And one of the incredible things about talking to sort of the supermen of science is that they understand science at such a profound level. The rest of us cannot compete and should not compete, but they all adhere. And I'm talking about the smartest guys in the room now. They adhere to what I call the Einstein principle, that you can explain something to a second grader if you really understand it. And I explain the power of the thermonuclear bomb in my book the way Garwin explained it to me. And I encourage people to read it, but I'll give you a short version of it. He said to me, Annie, the best way to understand the power of the thermonuclear is that it's a two-stage weapon that uses an atomic bomb inside of itself as a fuse, as a triggering device. Consider that when you want to understand the power of the
Whew.
megatons thermonuclears.